Welcome, everyone. Today we have a talk by Barbara Partee, an outstanding linguist and one of the pivotal figures in formal semantics, whose work has contributed a lot to our understanding of language and its structure. Let me use this opportunity to say that I've never thought that symbolic methods can be replaced by statistical ones, perhaps combined with, but not replaced by. Now, as we all know, formal semantics, considered Montague grammar, is closely connected to a good theory of syntax, like lambic calculus. And before Barbara will present her perspective on semantics and pragmatics and discuss the relationship between language and logic, there are going to be some more introductory words by Mati Pentus. Mati Reinovich, прошу.
Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Now, Barbara Partee is a well-known linguist. For example, in 1986, she was elected the president of the Linguistic Society of America. And well, I shall not list Barbara's innumerable honors and memberships in scientific academies in US and in European countries. But now for 30 years, Barbara worked at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, first as a professor and later as the head of the Department of Linguistics. And she has brought this university to one of the top linguistics universities in the world. She has supervised more than 30 PhD dissertations in linguistics and some dissertations in philosophy. And now I'll come to mathematics. During her undergraduate studies, Barbara took actually mathematics as her major. The minors were the Russian language and philosophy. And she is a great person to bring together these areas: mathematics, logic, philosophy, linguistics. During the graduate studies, her supervisor was Noam Chomsky at MIT. And after that, Barbara worked together with Richard Montague at University of California, Los Angeles. And Richard Montague was a mathematician and philosopher, a brilliant student of Alfred Tarski. For example, Richard Montague was the first to prove that ZFC cannot be finitely axiomatized. But in linguistics, Montague is known for his approach to the semantics of natural language. The Montague grammar is based on higher order predicate logic and lambda calculus, and it makes use of Kripke models and intentional logic. And now Barbara Partee continued Montague's work and popularized Montague's approach among linguists. And well, for me, it is my favorite topic, the categorical grammar. This comes from Montague's work, of course. Montague's grammar attempts a derivation of syntactic and semantic representation in tandem together. And the approach, Montague also studied much semantics of quantifiers and the scope and discourse. These are important topics in linguistics now. These have been later developed by Montague's student Hans Kamp. And now to Russia. Barbara speaks Russian very well, and she has close contacts with Russia. In 1996, she spent the fall term in Moscow, and after that, during 17 years, she spent almost every year the spring semester at Moscow, giving a one-term formal semantics course at Moscow State University or at Russian State Humanities University. I'm already abusing the time. I must say that Barbara Partee and Lisa Bolinina are the people who started my interest in linguistics. In autumn 2004, Barbara organized a semantics reading group at Moscow State University.
Lisa did.
Okay, yes. Now, yes, Lisa, I know that Lisa came to me. She said, Barbara is away this autumn term. She's at the States. And Barbara said, you need a professor who will be present at the reading group. And well, I agreed. We read lots of books and papers that Barbara selected together with other students. Igor Yanovich and Lisa Belinina were the main organizers. And the next year I attended Barbara's course on formal semantics at our university. So this is how I got involved in linguistics as a science. Well, thank you, Barbara, for bringing me to linguistics, or bringing linguistics to me. Well, thank you. Now I hand the microphone over probably to you, Barbara.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Matti. Just one small practical remark. There is a link to Barbara's handout in the chat. So you can look there if you want.
So I go now? I start?
Yep.
Okay. And is it being recorded? I don't see that.
It is being recorded, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, good, good. Because I promised some friends who couldn't make it, it would be recorded.
Yes, yes,
great.
everything is recorded and will not be lost, hopefully.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matti, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Lev and Stanislav, for inviting me to this exciting, to be part of this exciting event. Matti, you did a very nice thumbnail summary of my talk, and I can go much faster now. It's great. All right, so I'm very happy to be here. As Matti said, I have very close ties to Moscow and very close ties to logicians. So this is a very happy event for me to participate in. So let's see. Why doesn't my there? No, let's wait. Yeah, okay, all right, here we go. So pre-introduction, mini bio, but Matti just gave it. At Swarthmore, I was torn. When I started, I was torn between majoring in math and majoring in Russian. I love both math and languages. Russian was the most exotic language that was offered at Swarthmore, the only one that had a different alphabet. And I loved Russian music. But I saw no relation between math and languages, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So as Matti told you, I ended up majoring in math with minors in Russian and philosophy, just the three things I loved best, still seeing no connection. So my advice to students is go ahead and do what you love, because maybe the field you really want doesn't exist yet. And so do the things you love, and maybe you'll be able to find your way into such a field or help create it. So I discovered the existence of linguistics just in time to enter Chomsky's first class of PhD students at MIT from 61 to 65. That was heaven. It really was a kind of mathematically oriented way of looking at language, and I no longer had to choose between. So I became a syntactician and a Chomsky disciple. And in that mode, I went to my first job at UCLA, where I was from 65 to 72. And my old friend, David Lewis, who had been with me at Swarthmore and was at Harvard while I was at MIT, and we stayed friends, he introduced me to Richard Montague. He said, my colleague Richard Montague is starting to do things that you might find interesting. And indeed, I did. I first sat in on Montague's seminar in fall of 68. David Lewis was sitting in too, and that was good, because I had a lot of stupid questions I had to ask, and I couldn't just ask Montague directly. He was a little bit intimidating. Like, what's a lambda? That was the first hard question. Well, so that was exciting, and I was trying to learn and trying to understand. And then suddenly Montague died in 1971. He was murdered, and it was a tragedy. He was only 40, 41. Well, but then I started teaching Montague grammar and giving talks about it with the help of some of Montague's philosophy students. David Kaplan and I then took over directing them, and they were helping teach me as much as my helping them. And I moved to UMass Amherst in '72, and Terry Parsons came at the same time. And we influenced each other so that we could work on formal semantics together. And Emmon Bach came the year after, and UMass quickly became one of the centers of Montague grammar. That's my mini biography for who I am to start with. Here's a picture from 1974, the Linguistics Institute at UMass Amherst, all summer long. And we had a big section on semantics and philosophy of language. Everybody was there. So, and some people have since started saying that was the coming out party for Montague grammar. That was a T-shirt that Emmon had given me for my birthday that summer, so I could be clearly making it clear what I was doing. Okay, so what's formal semantics? It's an approach to semantics, the study of meaning, with roots in logic, philosophy of language, and linguistics. The word formal in formal semantics, that's not Hilbert's sense of formal. That's formal as opposed to informal. And it reflects the influence of logic and mathematics in the rise of scientific approaches to philosophy and to linguistics in the 20th century. So some of the distinctive characteristics of this approach are truth conditions and entailment relations as a central part of meaning. In most cases, a model theoretic conception of semantics, and definitely a guiding methodological principle, the principle of compositionality, that the meaning of a whole is a function of the meanings of its parts and of their mode of syntactic combination. Semantics traditionally meant quite different things to linguists, philosophers, and psychologists, since the different fields have different central concerns and different methodologies. Philosophers have always been concerned with truth and reference, with logic, with compositionality, with how meaning is connected with thought, and with the analysis of philosophically important terms. Linguists, influenced by Chomsky, care about what's in the head of a speaker of a language and how it's acquired by children. That's the magical feat that needs the most explanation. Psychologists experimentally study concept discrimination, concept acquisition. Their emphasis in semantics is always on the lexical level, different concepts, their relations to one another, etc. Syntax has very strongly influenced linguists' notions of logical form, because when you say anything about structure to a linguist is likely to think in terms of some sorts of tree diagrams, what the constituent parts are. So structure means a tree diagram. Logicians build formal systems with axioms and model theoretic interpretation. And so to a logician, structure more likely suggests inferential patterns or algebraic structures. And those are two very different ways of thinking that had not come together earlier. So formal semantics has its roots in several disciplines, most importantly logic, philosophy, and linguistics. And the most important figures in its history were Richard Montague and David Lewis, I think. And there were many other important contributors. I'll mention others, but nobody gets their fair treatment today because the story's big and time is short. The formal semantics as it's developed over the last 50 plus years has been shaped by fruitful interdisciplinary collaboration among linguists, philosophers, logicians, among others. There'd been centuries of studies of logic and language, and until the 19th century, the disciplines of logic, psychology, and linguistics were not yet separated, and issues of logic, thought, and language were often discussed together and closely intertwined. But today, I'm drawing on a book that's been in progress for a long time, still in progress, on history of the field. I'll trace some of the background and history of formal semantics, describing some of the advances and controversies that have shaped the field. I'll talk about some of the important contributions by logicians in formal semantics and as formal semantics and pragmatics developed after Montague's untimely death in 1971. as well as what I call the naturalizing influence that linguists have had on the field as it has become more and more a branch of linguistics, and the ongoing collaborations between linguists and logicians and philosophers. So in 1954, the philosopher and logician, wait, I think I skipped a slide. I did, sorry. Yeah, before Chomsky's syntactic structures in 1957. In the 19th century, linguistics existed as part of philology in Europe and largely within anthropology in the US, describing all these Native American languages, et cetera. Descriptive lexical semantics was important for philology, and the semantic analysis of kinship terms, et cetera, was important for anthropology. But there was little theoretical work, no syntax, no semantics above the word level. But in the 20th century, like so many other fields, linguistics emerged as a science. And part of the Chomskyan revolution was to view linguistics as a branch of psychology, now cognitive science. There were negative attitudes to semantics in American linguistics in the 20th century, partly influenced by logical positivism, partly by behaviorism in psychology. In logic and philosophy of language, there was great progress in semantics, but that was really unknown to most linguists. In 1954, the philosopher and logician Yehoshua Bar Hillel wrote an article in Language, that's the journal of the Linguistic Society of America, inviting cooperation between linguists and logicians. He knew what was going on in both fields. He knew what Chomsky was doing. He knew about all the advances in logic and philosophy of language. And he argued that advances in both fields would make the time ripe for an attempt to combine forces to work on syntax and semantics together. It was a great idea. He was a disciple of Carnap and had been influenced in various ways at various times by Idzikevich, Norbert Wiener, and the linguist Zelig Harris, who was Chomsky's teacher. But the very next year, Chomsky, who was then a PhD student, and like Yuri, like Yuri, I'm looking for some pictures of people when they were young. So that's young Chomsky. He wrote a reply in Language, arguing that the artificial languages invented by logicians were so unlike natural languages that the methods the logicians used had no chance of being of any use for linguistic theory. Chomsky and Bar Hillel were friends. They remained friends, but they differed on that point. And it took another 15 years or so for the synthesis that Bar Hillel was calling for to begin. And a later note, Bar Hillel was also working on Montague to pay attention to the linguists. He had just received one of Montague's pragmatics papers, and he wrote to Montague, "It will doubtless be a considerable contribution to the field, though I remain perfectly convinced that without taking into account the recent achievements in theoretical linguistics, your contribution will remain one-sided." Bar Hillel never gave up trying to get the logicians and linguists together. The Dutch philosopher Frits Staal, also tried on many occasions to get linguists, logicians, and philosophers together, including Chomsky and Montague. He founded the journal Foundations of Language with that aim. And he also edited the transcript from the symposium on the role of formal logic in the evaluation of argumentation in natural languages that Bar Hillel organized in 1967 at the Third International Congress for Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science in Amsterdam. Montague was there. Chomsky didn't go, but Jerry Katz, who represented the Chomsky side, was there, and many other people. That's an interesting conference. So Chomsky's syntactic structures, 1957, that's a kind of milestone year in linguistics. Chomsky concentrated on the native speaker's ability to produce and understand a potentially infinite class of sentences. So his conclusion was that linguistic competence must involve some finite description of an infinite class of sentences. His formulation of the goals of linguistic theory revolutionized the field. Before, it had been much more on finding methods for working from the phoneme to the morpheme, from the morpheme to the phrase, and trying to use discovery methods to write a grammar. And no notion of theory, no notion of trying to understand language acquisition. His syntax has been extremely influential. He has been ambivalent all along about semantics. He's been skeptical about the possibility of including semantics in a formal grammar. So it wasn't only the behaviorists who had negative attitudes towards semantics. He didn't actually have negative attitudes. He just thought semantics was somehow beyond what you could formalize. He has held, like Montague, that one test of a syntactic theory is that it should provide a basis for a good semantics, if only we had any idea what a good semantics should be. So Katzenfoder and then Katzenpostel were trying to add some semantics to Chomsky's theory. And in a theoretically important move within the Chomskyan approach, aiming for compositionality, Katzenpostel made an innovation of putting morphemes like a negation morpheme into a Chomskyan deep structure. So look at example 1. So a sentence like Mary has not visited Moscow. In earlier Chomsky, in syntactic structures, the underlying structure was just the underlying structure for Mary has visited Moscow. And negation would be a transformation that would negate the sentence. They suggested negation should be right in the deep structure of every negative sentence, and then meaning would be determined on the basis of the deep structure alone. The negation transformation wouldn't change meaning as it originally had in Chomsky's earlier work. It would just tell you where to put how to express the negation in that language. So in Chomsky's next book, The Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, he tentatively accepted Katzenpostel's hypothesis of syntax and semantics being connected at the level of deep structure. The deep structure is the input to semantic interpretation. Then the transformations get you to surface structure, and that's the input to phonology. So the architecture of the theory with syntax in the middle, semantics on one side, phonology on the other, was elegant and attractive. But that big change in the architecture rested on the claim that transformations should preserve meaning. I call that the Garden of Eden period, around 1965 and for a few years after, when Chomsky's theory and aspect was called the standard theory. So how did expulsion from the Garden of Eden happen? Well, a surprising historical accident is that the behavior of quantifiers with respect to transformational rules familiar from syntactic structures and aspects was not really noticed until the Katzenpostel hypothesis had already, for most linguists, reached the status of a necessary condition on writing rules. And I believe that historical accident was one of the major causes of the linguistic wars that erupted shortly thereafter between generative semantics and interpretive semantics. On the next slide, I'll give a few examples of derivations that would have been given in the aspects theory, where the examples given typically involve proper names like John and Mary. You look back at the early syntactic work, the noun phrases are always just John and Mary, something like that. Not quantifier phrases like every man or some man. And we'll see that in examples with names, the transformations are meaning preserving, but in corresponding examples with quantifiers, the transformations radically change the meaning. And it may change in different ways with different quantifiers, so you can't just write a certain meaning changing rule. I suspect the Katzenpostel hypothesis would never even have been suggested if these quantifier examples had been noticed earlier, and the history of syntax and semantics would have been different. So here's the kind of examples. So there was a reflexive transformation that would convert John voted for John into John voted for himself. So reflexive pronouns were understood as coming from a repeated occurrence of a noun phrase. But if you try that with a noun phrase like every man, you would have every man voted for every man as the underlying structure for every man voted for himself. Well, if you care about semantics, that's not very nice, right? There was another transformation called equinoun phrase deletion that was involved in sentences that have infinitival verb phrase complements. So underlying Mary wanted to win, deep structure was believed to be something like Mary wanted Mary to win. I'm not drawing the structures, I'm just giving you the strings, but you have to imagine trees on all of these. But if that's how equinoun phrase deletion works, then the deep structure for every candidate wanted to win would be every candidate wanted every candidate to win. Bad again, right? Conjunction reduction. It was believed that all phrasal conjunction, like 3 is even and odd, would be derived from 3 is even and 3 is odd. Well, that's semantically okay. I mean, it's a false sentence on both sides, right? But that same transformation would say that the underlying no number is both even and odd would be no number is even and no number is odd. Uh-oh. Right. Relative clause formation. That was thought to come from putting two sentences together. So you take the pacifist fought, the pacifist was inconsistent. You can form the pacifist who fought was inconsistent. Even that is not really right, but it's not so blatantly terrible looking. But if you try that with deriving all pacifists who fight are inconsistent from all pacifists fight and all pacifists are inconsistent, trouble again. So all over the place, every transformation that had anything to do with identity went wrong when you put in quantifiers instead of proper names or sometimes a definite description. Well, the Katz postal hypothesis and hence Chomsky's aspects incorporated the compositionality principle. The meaning of a whole is a function of the meaning of the parts and how they're syntactically combined. In aspects, the relevant notion of parts came from Chomsky's deep structure. And when that failed, when that picture failed because of these quantifiers, then there were some other things, but quantifiers were central and they're enough to show that the problem. The generative semanticists, Lakoff, Ross, Macaulay, they kept the goal of compositionality and they decided what was needed was to push the deep structure even deeper. And they made it kind of like a logical form. Their deep structures looked a lot like logical form, but they looked a lot like logical form in first order logic because that's all the logic that linguists knew. Now, Chomsky had been tentative about adopting the Katz postal hypothesis, and because he valued syntactic autonomy more highly, he and interpretive semanticists like Jackendorf abandoned the Katz postal hypothesis and kept their syntax, kept it more or less the way it was. The linguistic wars concerned the relation of syntax to semantics, though linguists in fact had relatively primitive ideas about what semantics might be. So now with the linguistic wars of the late 60s, early 70s raging, now I want to turn over to the philosophy and logic side before we manage to bring them together. So relevant history and philosophy goes back at least to Aristotle, but all I say about Aristotle today is his logic was so elegant that his syllogistic treatment of quantifier sentences became like a Bible for centuries. And that meant sentences with more than one quantifier in them and relations were ignored until about the 19th century. So the history of formally oriented approach toward philosophy of language goes back at least to Descartes and Leibniz, and Boole had in the 19th century had an algebraic conception for a system governing laws of thought, independent from the vagaries of natural language. Though Boolean algebra has widespread application for natural language semantics, whether Boole would like that or not. But the greatest foundational figure for formal semantics is Frege. His crucial ideas include the idea that function argument structure is the key to semantic compositionality. How do we put the parts of sentences together? Well, interpret one part as some function and the other part as an argument for it. Linguists never thought of that. I mean, and we didn't learn about Frege till after, I mean, people like Montague made us realize. So Frege is also credited with the principle of compositionality, which I think I've already repeated twice. And Frege introduced the distinction between sense and reference, Sinn and Bedeutung, which philosophers and semanticists have tried to formalize adequately ever since. One of his great contributions is the logical structure of quantified sentences, and that was part of the design of his Begriffsschrift, a logically perfect language to satisfy Leibniz's goals. Frege did not see himself as offering an analysis of natural language, though when you read his papers, you see lots of analysis there. But he was offering a tool to augment it as the microscope augments the eye. He also figured out a systematic and compositional semantics for variable binding, prefiguring something Tarski did 50 years later, and perhaps more compositionally to an extent. Frege rejected the psychologism of many of his predecessors, including John Stuart Mill. This is an interesting issue that arose again in a different form when linguists began to import logicians' tools into linguistics, and we'll return to it at the end. Mill said logic is a branch of psychology. And Mill wrote, so far as it is a science at all, logic is a part or branch of psychology, differing from it on the one hand as the part differs from the whole, and on the other as an art differs from a science. So logic was just an art, right? This really means logic as argumentation and how to avoid fallacy, I think. Its theoretical grounds are wholly borrowed from psychology and include as much of that science as is required to justify its rules of art. Frege disagreed strongly. One of his main theses is that mathematics and logic are not part of psychology, and that the objects and laws of mathematics and philosophy are not defined, illuminated, proven true, or explained by psychological observations and results. One of his central arguments for this thesis is the consideration that whereas mathematics is the most exact of all sciences, psychology is imprecise and vague. Frege claims that in the realm of logic, we find both descriptive and prescriptive laws, and the former are the foundation for the latter. Every law that states what is can be apprehended as prescribing that one ought to think in accordance with it. This holds of geometrical and physical laws no less than logical laws. Frege's main criticism of psychological logic is that it conflates true and being taken to be true. So psychologism is indeed a foundational issue in semantics. Still, yeah. So just a few key 20th century advances in logic and semantics. Russell introduced logical types to avoid the paradoxes he had found and used them to impose restrictions on well-formed function argument expressions. Early Carnap used theory of types syntactically for the logical construction of the world and the logical construction of language. Tarski developed model theory based in set theory and made major advances in providing a semantics for logical languages, including his semantical definition of truth. Later, Carnap, influenced in part by Tarski, developed a semantic approach where meaning equals truth conditions, an idea he got from early Wittgenstein, something which later Wittgenstein disagreed with. But Carnap introduced possible worlds as state descriptions and analyzed intensions as functions from possible worlds to extensions. Carnap and Tarski both had major influence on Montague's work. Tarski was his teacher. Carnap was at UCLA when Montague was there and was David Kaplan's teacher. Well, now, ordinary language and formal language wars in philosophy of language. In the late 40s, a war began within philosophy of language. The ordinary language philosophers, like late Wittgenstein, Ryle, Austin, and Strawson, they rejected the formal approach. They urged attention to ordinary language, its uses, and its context dependence. Context dependence being something that was completely absent from logical languages at the time. Strawson, in On Referring, talking about Russell's analysis of definite descriptions, wrote, "The actual unique reference made, if any, is a matter of the particular use in the particular context. Neither Aristotelian nor Russellian rules give the exact logic of any expression of ordinary language, for ordinary language has no exact logic." Russell, 1957, in Mr. Strawson on Referring, writes, "I may say to begin with that I am totally unable to see any validity whatever in any of Mr. Strawson's arguments." And he goes on to demolish the arguments and then ends by saying, "I agree, however, with Mr. Strawson's statement that ordinary language has no logic." But Russell was not the first philosopher to complain about the illogicality of natural language. One of his big complaints was the way English puts phrases like every man, a horse, the king into the same syntactic category as names like Smith. No coincidence, that's the same issue that brought down the end of the Garden of Eden in linguistics. He considered the formulas of his first order logic a much truer picture of logical form of English sentences than the structure of those English sentences themselves. So my old colleague Terry Parsons reports that when he first started thinking about natural language in the late 60s, he was very much aware of the tradition from Russell that the grammar of natural language is a bad guide to doing semantics. But then rereading on denoting, he realized that Russell in that paper actually has something very close to an algorithm for going from this bad syntax that English gives us to the good semantics that Russell wants. And that would suggest that the grammar of natural language was not such a bad vehicle for expressing meaning, including the meaning of sentences with quantifiers, definite descriptions, etc. The interesting response of some formally oriented philosophers to the ordinary language, formal language war, was to try to analyze ordinary language better, including its context-dependent features. The generation that included Arthur Prior, Bar Hillel, Reichenbach, Curry, and Montague gradually became more optimistic about being able to formalize the crucial aspects of natural language. Along with Bar Hillel's calls for linguistics philosophy cooperation, Fritz Stahl and several colleagues launched the journal Foundations of Language, calling for broader interdisciplinary cooperation. That's the journal whose successor is the current Linguistics and Philosophy journal. Arthur Prior made great progress on the analysis of tense, which is one central source of context dependence in natural languages, which had been omitted from earlier logical languages. He visited UCLA in 1965, and he and Montague influenced each other. Montague gave him more of an idea of what formalization should look like, and he brought these context-dependent issues very much to Montague's attention. Here's just some people and some groups. I'm not gonna, I said I can't do justice to all the many people that were involved. I just let you look at this slide for a minute before I go on, because there were many things going on in many places. What happened with Montague at UCLA became particularly influential, but he was not working in a vacuum by any means. Okay, so Montague's work. So Montague, a student of Tarski's, was an important contributor to these developments. As Matti mentioned, his higher order typed intentional logic unified tense logic and modal logic, extending Prior's work and the work that had been going on in modal logic. And more generally, bringing context dependence, unified formal pragmatics with intentional logic. Pragmatics in Montague's work really means things that are context dependent, the personal pronouns, the tenses, the demonstratives, as that David Kaplan worked on, etc. Montague also generalized the intentional notions of property, proposition, individual concept, etc., into a fully typed intentional logic, extending the work of Carnap, Church, and Kaplan, putting together Frege's function argument structure with the treatment of intensions, not as state descriptions, but as functions from world time indices to extensions. This was partly in collaboration with Dana Scott, those ideas. What made his approach daunting for linguists, at least, also made it powerful. Well, not only for linguists. Max Cresswell said if he hadn't been at UCLA to hear Montague lecture, he would have had a lot of trouble reading Montague's papers himself. The rich type structure made it possible to have semantic types, not just for sentences, predicates, and terms, but for determiners, determiner phrases, modifiers, degree phrases, etc. That made it much easier to work compositionally with an independently motivated syntax and not have to try to make a syntax that looked like first order logic as the generative semanticists done. Now, why did Montague turn to natural language? It wasn't an obvious thing because as a student of Tarski, finding proofs of non-trivial theorems was always the gold standard of what a working logician should be striving for. But I found an important clue. I got some good clues from Hans Kamp and from Montague's PhD, Nino Cocchiarella. Then I found a really valuable clue in the Montague archives, where luckily all of Montague's papers and drafts and things are preserved at the UCLA library. I found a handwritten preamble attached to the handout of an early talk on his paper, English as a Formal Language, before the paper was finished. And this was something he didn't write, but he said it to his audience at the beginning. He wrote in shorthand for the little word, so I had to learn some shorthand to read his notes, but I've got it. I know I've got this right now. So he wrote, "This talk is the result of two annoyances. One, the distinction some philosophers, especially in England, draw between formal and informal languages. And secondly, the great sound and fury that nowadays issues from MIT under the label of mathematical linguistics or the new grammar, a clamor not to the best of my knowledge accompanied by any accomplishments." For ages, I thought that word must be many, but I really worked on it. That word was any. I therefore sat down one day and proceeded to do something that I previously regarded and continue to regard as both rather easy and not very important. Oh, that killed me when I read that part. That is to analyze ordinary language. I shall, of course, present only a small fragment of English, but I think a rather revealing one. And he had an inserted note that there did exist other creditable work: traditional grammar, Ajukevich, the computational linguists Bonert and Bakker, and Hans Kamp. Later notes in the archive from when he was working on his last paper and had notes for things that he never put into that paper because he couldn't solve them. These later notes suggest he eventually found it not entirely easy. And now, what about his view of the importance of his own work? As he said in that what I just quoted, he didn't think it was very important. So this is from Stahl's edited proceedings of that wonderful Bar Hillel 1967 symposium. So Montague said, "As far as the main points are concerned, let me first deplore the distinction customarily drawn between formal and informal languages. The syntax and semantics of certain not insignificant fragments of English can be treated just as formally and precisely as those of the first order predicate calculus, and in very much the same manner. No adequate treatment of this sort has yet been published. One has, however, recently been developed by my student, J.A.W. Kump, and myself. I might add that our treatment relies on certain developments in intentional logic. Thus, the methods developed in connection with artificial languages can be employed to yield completely precise notions of truth and logical consequence for significant fragments of natural language. Yet, although I have myself devoted some time to this goal, I somewhat question its importance. Is it really so important to be able to establish conclusively that a given argument in a natural language is invalid? Note, by the way, that Montague seemed to think there was no interest in semantics for its own sake, but only to try to analyze arguments as valid or invalid. I believe that as the scope of, this is Montague, I believe that as the scope of exact artificial languages is enlarged, people will begin to use them for argumentation. Witness the gradual abandonment of ordinary language by mathematicians between 1875 and the present. So Montague's first work on natural language was the provocatively titled English as a Formal Language, familiarly known as EFL. Montague had taught that material at UCLA in the spring of 1965, the first year that Hans Kamp was there, and at the University of Amsterdam in the spring of 1966, where he had a lot of interesting interactions. English as a formal language famously begins, "I reject the contention that an important theoretical difference exists between formal and natural languages." As noted by Emmon Bach in his lovely reader-friendly book, Informal Lectures on Formal Semantics, the term theoretical here must be understood from a logician's perspective and not from a linguist's. What Montague was denying was the central presupposition of the formal language, ordinary language wars, a mismatch between linguistic form and logical form for natural languages, and a revocation of what Russell was claiming about natural language being so unlogical and unsystematic. What he was proposing here and in his paper, Universal Grammar, which really spells out the theory, was a framework for describing syntax and semantics and the relation between them, a framework that he considered compatible with existing practice for formal languages and an improvement on existing practice for the description of natural language. The Fregean principle of compositionality was central and remains central. His syntax semantics interface was that syntax is in algebra, semantics is in algebra, and compositionality is the requirement that there be a homomorphism from the former to the latter. Not quite that simple, really into the polynomial closure of the latter, but it's an algebraic notion of compositionality. The nature of the elements of the syntactic and semantic algebras is left open. What's constrained is the relation between them. And the differences between Montague's own higher order typed intentional logic and first order predicate logic made a crucial difference for the possibility of giving a compositional semantics based on a relatively conservative syntax for English. Let me give an example that made a big impact on me when I encountered it and on many linguists since. So an exercise that I always give my students, Mati will remember this, Lisa Belinin is here, she will remember this. I say, where in Russell's formula 10, which symbolizes every man walks, is the meaning of every man? And you look at that formula, you see, well, the quantifier is part of it. The arrow is part of it, because if the quantifier were some, you'd have a conjunction in there and not the if then. The X's are part of it. Man is part of it. In fact, everything is part of everything in that formula except the predicate walk. If I knew how to annotate, I'd be drawing circles here. But everything in there except the predicate walk is representing the meaning of every man. It's a syncategorematic treatment. There's no constituent in the logical formula that corresponds to every man. So one way to answer Russell, because of course, if that's the right logical form, then English is very misleading. But one way to answer Russell is to devise a logic in which the translation of every man is a constituent in the logical language. Terry Parsons did it with a variable free combinatoric logic. Montague did it with his higher order typed intentional logic. Both were influenced by seeing how to devise algorithms for mapping from parts of English onto formulas of first order logic, thereby realizing that English itself was not so logically unruly. First order logic has many virtues, but similarity to natural language syntax is not one of them. So one of the first things that impressed linguists about Montague and Lewis's work was how with the higher typed logic and lambdas or other ways to talk about functions, DPs, that is determiner phrases like the man, every linguist, no logician, and John, can be uniformly interpreted as generalized quantifiers, sets of entities. And determiners like the, every, some, no, most, can be interpreted as functions that apply to common noun phrase meanings, like meanings of things like man, to make generalized quantifiers. Recall how we asked, where's the meaning of every man in 10, in that formula on the previous page. So if you look at the meaning that Montague gives, well, the translation into his intentional logic, which itself then gets interpreted model theoretically. These translations are eliminable, but they're there for perspicuity. They're reader friendly. So if you look at the formula for every student, it's the set of properties P, such that for all X, if X is a student, X has P. That's gotten by just doing lambda abstraction on walks with the property variable P, right? So you go from you can get from Russell's formula to the generalized quantifier just by abstracting on walks. The result is a constituent that can take the predicate walk as its argument. And by lambda conversion, you see that the result is equivalent to what Russell's thought the structure was. So there's no argument in Montague about the meaning of every student walks. It's just what's the structure? How do you get to that meaning? And with Montague, it's compositional. Russell thought it couldn't be. So now we have a semantic type. ETT means sets of entities to correspond to English DPs, what we used to call noun phrases. The DP denotes a function, The verb phrase is its one-place predicate argument. Here's some more examples. So just for uniformity, Montague treated John the same way, the set of all those properties that John has. So instead of, I mean, there's a individual variable, an individual constant J at the root of it. So in a sense, the E-type meaning, the entity type meaning of John is still central, but the noun phrase, the full noun phrase John is a generalized quantifier. It's interpreted as a generalized quantifier. So apply it to walk, you get back walk of J, but in this structure of John walks, John is the function, walk is the argument. Every student is a set of properties every student has. A student is the set of properties at least one student has. The king is the set of properties P, such that there's one and only one king, such that there's an X who is the one and only one king, and X has P. So once Montague had shown what could be done with the use of model theoretic techniques for compositional semantic interpretation and with a higher order intentional logic, linguists and philosophers set about coming up with extensions and modifications to fit natural language phenomena even better. Many aspects of Montague's own analyses of English have been superseded with major linguistically motivated innovations by Comte, Parsons, Heim, Kierkegaard, Kratzer, Ruth, Roberts, many others. In overall impact, Montague's first works were as profound for semantics as Chomsky's were for syntax. Evan Bach, in the book that I mentioned, summed up their cumulative innovations. Chomsky's thesis was that English can be described as a formal system. Montague's thesis was that English can be described as an interpreted formal system. So truth conditions and entailment relations are basic. Those are data that have to be accounted for to reach a minimal level of adequacy in semantics. The advent of truth conditions and the tools of model theory made semantics an incomparably more powerful discipline than it had been before, that is, for linguists. It may be hard to realize how surprising and controversial an idea it was to linguists in the early 70s that we should think about truth conditions rather than just ambiguity, semantic anomaly, synonymy. And from that, for instance, from that work on generalized quantifiers, the logician John Barwise and the linguist Robin Cooper, my first UMass PhD student, cooperated in the first major investigation of the properties of determiners, studied from the perspective of model theoretic properties of generalized quantifiers and the determiners that helped to build them. And lots of generalizations that linguists had discovered descriptively, they were able to show what model theoretic properties were underlying those linguistic properties. And recursion on open sentences, that was a big deal. That also solves that problem that I had pointed out that led to expulsion from the Garden of Eden. That together with Frege's function argument application led to far better semantic analysis of, for instance, relative clauses that had been achieved by linguists before or during the semantic wars. Quine didn't invent this treatment of relative clauses. It's actually, Montague didn't invent this treatment of relative clauses. Quine has it in word and object, but it hadn't reached wide attention of linguists from there. I mean, you know, a lot of these things are historical accidents about what do linguists read or who interacts with whom and then can spread the word. So I just want to recall how impossible it had been to do justice to relative clauses in quantified noun phrases in the earlier linguistic work. So we have relative clauses in examples in 16. The man who won the men's race was a Kenyan. Every child who carved a pumpkin got a prize. Some child who carved a pumpkin got a prize. If you do it by combining kernel sentences, as Chomsky did in syntactic structures, containing identical noun phrases that get smushed together in the relative clause, that can't be right. It can't be right even with the definite description in A, because if you say the man won the men's race, that sentence presupposes there was just one man. And to go on and say he was a Kenyan, it would have to be a non-restrictive, the man, comma, who won the men's race. It's a kind of nonsensical sentence. And certainly every child carved a pumpkin and every child got a prize. It should not be the source for every child who carved a pumpkin got a prize. semanicists looking for deep structures that would capture the meanings of these sentences proposed analyses resembling first-order logic, and they had different underlying structures for different relative clauses. In the case where the determinant is every, they said, oh, these relative clauses are derived from if clauses. So with a deep structure, something like every X in the set of men, if X won the men's race, then X was a Kenyan. For the example where the determiner is the indefinite sum, then they proposed the relative clause in the underlying structure of that sentence was conjoined with the main clause. So some X in the set denoted by child, X carved a pumpkin, and X got a prize. With only first order logic to work with, it's hard to see how else to get the semantics right. But we don't need and we don't want different interpretations for these relative clauses. The relative clauses don't differ. What differs is the determiner. All restrictive relative clauses can be understood as functioning just like an adjective. That a relative clause is a way to take a sentence and turn it into something like an adjective. They're all type ET, one place predicates, denoting sets, just like nouns and simple adjectives. So what do we want to do for every boy who loves Mary is happy? Well, the interpretation of boy who loves Mary, which is where we put the relative clause together with the noun, that can be just the intersection of the noun set boy and the who loves Mary set. Those are both one place predicates denoting sets. Boy is the set, boy denotes the set of boys. Who loves Mary denotes the set of individuals X such that X loves Mary. Boy, the expression boy, the expression who loves Mary, and the expression boy who loves Mary, they're all one place predicates. And so it's predicate conjunction or set intersection that puts them together uniformly. And on generalized quantifier theory, all determiners are functions that first combine with their one place predicate noun phrase argument, and then combine with the rest of the sentence, which will also be interpreted as a one place predicate. In the simplest case, the rest of the sentence is just the verb phrase. But in more complicated cases, you may have to abstract on the rest of the sentence to get the one place predicate. So I hope that shows that the relative clause is completely uniform and simple, and all of that variation was just coming from independent facts about the meanings of every versus some versus the. Okay. So now on to the joint work by linguists and philosophers and logicians. So Montague was doing his work on natural language at the height of the linguistic wars, although Montague and the semanticists in linguistics had no awareness of one another at that point. The earliest introduction of Montague's work to linguists came via my papers starting in '73, and Rich Thomason, who published Montague's collected works with a long introductory chapter in '74. Both of us argued that Montague's work might allow the syntactic structures generated by linguists to be relatively conservative, the way Chomsky wanted, for instance, and with relatively minimal departure from direct generation of surface structure, maybe even closer to surface structure than the way Chomsky was doing it, while offering a principled way to address many of the semantic concerns that motivated the best work in generative semantics. So it really could reconcile these two competing desiderata. So let me review an obstacle I faced when I started trying to put Montague grammar and transformational grammar together, whose solution is related to a leading idea that came into linguistics from philosophy and logic, namely the Fregean idea that recursion must be done on open sentences. That was what Frege saw as the solution to the problem of quantified sentences in general. So the obstacle was, what about deletion rules? In classical transformational grammar, Mary was eager to win was derived from something like Mary was eager for Mary to win by a transformation that would delete an identical noun phrase. But given the principle of compositionality, and given the way Montague grammar works by building up the meanings of constituents from the meanings of their subconstituents, there's nothing that could correspond to deleting a piece of a meaning of a part you've already put together. And recall the consequences of that very transformation for a sentence like everyone was eager to win. That presumed deep structure would clearly give the wrong meaning. So the resolution that I suggested in my earliest papers, introducing Montague grammar to linguists and trying to put it together with transformational grammar, was what we want as underlying subject in the embedded sentence is a bindable variable. I followed Montague's line and bound it by lambda abstraction, so the complement never was a complete sentence, but just a verb phrase. Others did a similar thing, keeping the sentence type for that embedded infinitive, binding the variable higher up in the sentence. But either way, we completely avoid that problem. We don't get anything like everyone was eager for everyone to win. We get a meaning that says everyone was an X such that X was eager for X to win. That solution is one illustration of the importance of the Fregean principle that wherever quantifiers may be involved, recursion must be allowed to work on open sentences. And Chomsky's syntactic structure had no notion of open sentences. The kernel sentences were always sentences. It was Montague's use of lambda abstraction as the active variable binding operator in his proper treatment of quantification paper and other papers that unified variable binding in connection with quantification, relative clauses, interrogatives, other things. Lambda abstraction creates compositional names for functions, and that's central to function argument-centered type theory. In retrospect, it was doing recursion on closed sentences that made all those rules that involved identical NPs break down when quantifiers were discovered. And I should mention, you don't have to do it with lambdas and functions. Polly Jacobson has followed the kind of line that Terry Parsons started earlier on how to capture these properties within a variable-free semantics using combinators. Now, although Montague's last paper is called The Proper Treatment of Quantification in Ordinary English, one may notice the only quantifiers he actually treated there were the indefinite article and every and the. When I went to the archives, I saw that manuscript notes showed that he originally wanted to include many more, but he didn't have a treatment of plurality, and that limited him greatly. Other singular determiners he thought about included no and any, but he was not prepared to treat negation other than simple sentential negation, and he saw problems with any. There are many problems with any that he didn't have solutions for. Early attempts to treat plurals, like Michael Bennett's, I should mention, Michael Bennett was one of the two students at PhD students at UCLA who were Montague students at the time Montague died. And then David Kaplan and I jointly became their dissertation advisors. In his 1974 dissertation, he treated plurals, he put them in a higher type than singulars. So he made sets of entities, which caused considerable complexity and non-uniformity in the grammar, because you had to have multiple types for all the things that could combine with the nouns. The first relatively successful treatment of mass nouns and plural nouns came in a 1983 paper by the logician and philosopher Godehard Link, who made a major innovation by positing algebraic structure inside the domain of type B entities. This was an example of the kind of thing that linguists really embraced when it was offered to us, but I don't think any of us could have invented it. Link proposed that a singular count noun denotes a set of atomic entities, that's as Montague had, and a plural count noun denotes a set of plural entities, still entities, but he made distinctions within the entity domain. The denotation of a plural noun forms an atomic semilattice structure, and the denotation of a mass noun is similar, but it's a not necessarily atomic structure. So Link, for the first time, made a formal system that met the linguist's intuitive realization that mass nouns are more basic in the world's languages than count nouns. But everything that philosophers had been doing earlier, trying to analyze mass nouns, was treating them as quantities of matter or something, reducing them to some funny kind of thing that you represent with the count noun structure. Okay, so that was a great help from logicians. Other contributions from logicians. Well, tense logic, of course. The semantics of tense and aspect is a big area under continuing active investigation. It's really rich typologically. Different languages do different things, but they're all describable nicely with the kind of techniques that we got starting with foundational contributions by Hans Kamp, who was Montague's student, who also interacted with Pryor when Pryor visited UCLA in Hans's first year. And there have been many further logic linguistic collaborations in that area. There's even a paper by me and Michael Bennett on tense and aspect, but we didn't, we figured out a lot of things, but we didn't make a really compositional account, so we were never completely content with it. And then there's modal logic and the logical logic of conditionals, important work by David Lewis and by the linguist Angelica Kratzer, who spent a year in New Zealand studying with logician Max Creswell. And dynamic logic, Groenendijk and Stokov in Amsterdam, and a different conception of what that means in work by Hans Kamp and Irene Heim, to handle things like anaphora across multiple sentences and the so-called donkey sentences and a whole family of related problems. That's an important change. It's not universally adopted, but it's very influential, taking sentence meanings not as truth conditions, but as context change potentials. So a sentence is interpreted in a context, but the very interpretation process may add things to the context. And then there's a foundational idea of using property theory instead of type theory. Cocchiarella has a version. The logician Ray Turner and the linguist Gennaro Kierke, one of my students, worked together on this to make intentions more intentional, because the standard treatment in Montague and many others of intentions, propositions as sets of possible worlds, well, sets are too extensional. That's what gets us the problem of all logically equivalent propositions counting as the same proposition on that conception. So maybe property theory, but property theory is hard work, and maybe it wasn't enough of a sales job. It hasn't really caught on widely among linguists, but I still think it's a good idea. So the height of initial interaction on semantics between linguistics and philosophers had passed by 1980, followed by the rise of cognitive science, including semantics, and then by specialization of semantics inside linguistics, with many individual scholars maintaining links of various kinds within and across the disciplines, and conferences and journals that keep the lines of communication wide open. By the middle of the 80s, formal semantics was recognized as part of the core curriculum in linguistics. There were a number of textbooks and a growing number of departments with more than one semanticist. And formal semantics spread and became mainstream semantics in the US and Europe, in spite of Chomsky's skepticism. And in fact, MIT hired its first formal semanticist, Irene Heim, in '89, its second, Kai von Fintel, in '94, and quickly became one of the leading programs in formal semantics as well as syntax. By the early 90s, formal semantics, long since no longer called Montague grammar, although that's just about the time that the expression Montague grammar made it into the Oxford English Dictionary, was a fully established field, and students weren't even conscious that the core fields had not always been phonology, syntax, semantics. By the late 90s, linguistics philosophy interaction was on the increase again and more sophisticated. For instance, in part to teaching by and advising at MIT by Robert Stelnicker in philosophy and Irene Heim in linguistics. That's Irene. With the work of Irene Heim, Angelica Kratzer, Gennaro Kierke, and others, there was also greater integration of formal semantics with Chomskyan syntax. And now a lot of important work is at the syntax semantics interface. So my early attempts to unify with Chomskyan syntax didn't really work, and things at UMass went often in the direction of non-transformational theories like extended categorical grammar, etc. But now there's a great deal of work combining formal semantics with Chomskyan syntax. And if there's 5 more minutes, I want to, is that okay, Lev?
That's okay.
I assume that. Okay. I want to briefly mention the important foundational issue that I alluded to earlier, that's been with the field of formal semantics since linguistics first became part of its history. As I mentioned, the Chomskyan revolution included putting human linguistic competence at the center of study. What's in the head of a speaker of a language, how it's acquired. And when some of us took on the challenge of combining Montague's semantics with Chomsky's syntax, technical and substantive progress was rapid and successful, no doubt about that. But there was still the apparent incompatibility of two views of what we were doing. There's Chomsky's view of linguistics as a branch of psychology, and the anti-psychologistic Fregean tradition viewing meanings as abstract objects. In hindsight, what I once saw as a problem, I now see as a good thing. Semantics really helps to push us toward a less narrow view of what human linguistic competence is and what psychological reality should mean. These foundational problems arise particularly for lexical semantics, where there are issues that have no counterparts in syntactic competence. The recursive compositional rules for combining meanings are similar to syntactic rules in the sense that they're relatively unproblematic. They're all finitely statable. And if people differ in these rules, we just say they have different dialects. But for the lexicon, in syntax, there always seem to be no worries in principle. The lexicon is finite, not counting words like anti, missile. I can't count those right, but anyway, or great-grandmother. At worst, the lexicon can be memorized. In semantics, on the other hand, some of the biggest worries have concerned the lexicon. It was on the basis of natural terms like tiger that Putnam in 1975 argued that meanings ain't in the head. Putnam argued, for instance, that even though he could not tell a beech tree, I think that's beek, or buk, I keep forgetting which, I get it mixed up with the word for ox. The beech in Russian is well, never mind, because I don't know elm either. What?
So you mean the tree which is called in Russian buk?
Yes, buk. Yes. And I don't know what elm and what's elm and what's elm tree in Russian. I don't know that either. Yasin. Okay. So Putnam said he could not tell a beech from an elm, but beech and elm, that did not mean that beech and elm in his language both just had the meaning some deciduous tree, but rather they pick out the natural kinds, beech and elm, by virtue of Putnam, being part of a language community that has a certain history that goes back to the naming of these trees. There are no comparable problems in syntax. In syntax, you don't have to know what somebody else thinks the syntactic rules are like. You have your own syntactic rules, and if two people differ, we just say they speak different dialects. But with the lexicon is a much more social construct, and that's complicated. So Putnam said, so theory of meaning came to rest on two unchallenged assumptions. First, the kind of Chomskyan one, that knowing the meaning of a term is just a matter of being in a certain psychological state. Well, it's not just Chomskyan. I mean, that's what knowing a meaning should be, right? But secondly, that the meaning of a term in the sense of intention determines its extension. And Putnam said, I shall argue that these two assumptions are not jointly satisfied by any notion, let alone any notion of meaning. So how can we get a resolution to this tension? Well, it's possible, I think. It comes from arguments by Stalnaker and Burge about the need to revise what we take psychological realism to be, how we think about this metaphor of being in the head. Stalnaker in '89 wrote that meanings are in the head, but more like the sense in which footprints are in the sand. Footprints are imprinted in the sand, but they're not footprints in the sand unless they had a certain causal history, right? The problem had come from taking a too narrow view of in the head, like a brain in a vat kind of view. So Stalnaker wrote, a representational system is a system that's capable of being in a range of alternative internal states that tend to be causally dependent on the environment in a systematic way. And Tyler Burge, following up in this kind of idea, argues that Chomsky's view of grammar in the mind underestimates the degree to which, quote, the natures of many mental states constitutively depend on relations to a subject matter that is beyond the individual. Stalnaker's and Burge's work suggests that we should combine work on individual semantic representations of the sort linguists cook up with much more research on how those representations come to have the external relational content that makes reference possible. If we think of knowing a language in a hyper-intellectualized way, as Burge put it, then an interpreted language, as Montague understood it, cannot be known by a human, cannot be in the head. But if we follow Burge in drawing insight from perception and how perception gives fallible but normally veridical knowledge prior to any reasoning, we can see semantics, including the difficult area of lexical semantics, as a particularly important and fruitful branch of psychology. Perception involves a relation between perceiver and external objective reality. Psychologists study perception, but they don't try to suggest that external reality isn't part of it. Perception is normally veridical, but can be in error. That's something we can work on and study. Reference and truth conditions involve a relation between language user and external reality. Language is normally understood correctly, but language user can be mistaken. That notion of possible mistakenness is something that does not arise in syntax, but does in semantics. I mean, in syntax there's slips of the tongue, etc. But what your knowledge is, that's not questioned. Language, of course, goes beyond objective representation, and there are other deep problems surrounding lexical meaning. But the puzzle of how to relate basic truth conditional semantics to semantic competence can be thereby resolved, and cognitive science is the richer for it. That's it. There's some more references if you have the handout, and I'll just end with this screen with an incomplete list of acknowledgements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stanislav gave me the role of the chair of this session back because of some sound disturbance that he experiences at his place.
I'm lucky that I got through without my Wi-Fi failing again.
Well, we heard some dog barking in the background, but that was okay.
That's my dog. You're lucky I didn't let her be in the study with me, or you would have seen her as well and maybe heard her louder.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. So the time for discussion will. There will be plenty of questions, and we have a long time for discussion. So let me.
Sorry.
Well, something like 30 minutes we do have. So
okay.
If you don't mind.
I don't. Yeah.
Okay. So let me begin just again with my own little question. Something drew my attention in what you said. Firstly, this wonderful quotation from Montague expressing how easy it was to formalize natural language, so to say. So how would you explain that optimism? I mean, is it part of that general intellectual atmosphere of those times where they thought that, okay, in a decade, computers will solve all our problems and things like that?
No, I don't think it was the general optimism. I think it was Montague's arrogance and self-confidence. He believed he could solve anything.
Okay, good. Then another short remark that what is interesting that you said that typical for the views of the philosophers at the beginning of the century, like Russell, for example, or Frege, that they considered their formal languages as a kind of improvement on the inadequacies of the natural language. So it was a kind of stance that the natural language is imprecise and therefore it has to be improved somehow.
Yes, for a long time. I mean, Quine, I think, used to use the term regimentation. You take things you find in natural language, you clean them up and formulate it.
Now my question is the following. So is there any place for such a view nowadays? I mean, of course, now linguists think about it in a totally different manner. But what about, viewing, or is there a place for kind of languages which serve particular goal, like semi-formal languages, which would be
Sure.
kind of improvement on both sides,
I
both
think
formal and informal. So what do you think about it?
I think undoubtedly. I mean, I think linguists are interested in natural language for its own sake, and we want to understand how it works. And we're not trying to improve on natural language for human, as humans use it. We want to study it, not improve it. But for instance, if you want to have a theorem prover, I don't think anybody wants to try to make a theorem prover that works with natural language. I mean, you want good logical languages for technical reasons. I mean, mathematicians want good languages for doing mathematics. Physicists need good languages. Chemists, and there were linguists in Moscow in the institute where my husband was working. Paducheva, for instance, was part of a group working on how to give exact characterizations of the chemical compound formulas for organic chemistry, and so you could work with them in text extraction and things. So yeah, so of course there's use for all sorts of formalized language. So I mean, Frege had a very sound view. He said it augments natural language. His formal language augments natural language the way the microscope augments the eye. He didn't suggest that the eye was bad, right? But just for some purposes, you wanted a tool that had other properties.
Okay, thank you. I will now follow the questions in chat, and maybe you can also open them and see them
Maybe
for
I can,
yourself,
yeah.
but I will read.
Oh, there's a lot.
There is a lot, so you don't have to read them all.
Well, I let you be the moderator.
But okay, the first question came from Andrei Rodin, and let me give him the words. So he wanted to ask them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lev. Thank you very much, Barbara, for that great talk. I have a question officially about truth conditionality and entailment that you actually mentioned twice in your talk, in the very beginning and then already in the second part after. And both times you really stressed that those are basic features of formal semantics. And actually, I first heard about that maybe almost 30 years ago when I was a student, and I became skeptical. And I think I'm still skeptical. So probably you'll help me somehow evaluate my skepticism. So reason why I was skeptical was that it looked like this. No, let's just talk about truth conditionality, living entailment. So it's appeared as is a strong philosophical thesis, of course, right? That theory of meaning somehow is reduced or based on truth conditionality. And there are philosophical arguments pro and contra, which, okay, we probably know, but it looked like that pragmatic decision, just to use this as a basic principle, was a kind of arbitrary. I mean, just correct me if I'm wrong, but at least as I perceived it, and I still perceive, I think, that way, that just certain bright people like you, like your colleagues, they understood that if you buy this assumption, right, this philosophical thesis, then you get kind of available mathematical apparatus, right? So you have Frege and Russell on your side, so you can go ahead. And that made me skeptical because it doesn't look like really, how say, philosophically grounded decision. And probably more recently, of course, when we have this automated translation realized, but like does not look like it's realized because of this truth conditional theory of meaning, but some other ways which we, as Yuri mentioned yesterday, probably don't understand quite. So it's once again a reason somehow to question this principle.
Okay, so yeah, okay, so let me go sort of work backwards. First on automatic translation. there's no evidence that the automatic translation systems understand what they're doing. I mean, so it's,
Okay.
let me just bracket any reference to automatic translation. So really, my colleague and former student and respected colleague Gennaro Kerkia, when he teaches formal semantics now, he does not talk about truth conditions. He emphasizes entailment relations. And he says, really, we want to get the entailment relations right, and we don't necessarily have to build them from truth conditions. Or it's I mean, I have completely under this, but it's, those things are in principle separable. I myself would say truth conditions are certainly not giving us all of meaning. And in a sense, it's, as you say, a pragmatic decision. I think truth conditions, insofar as sentences have truth conditions, and questions and imperatives can be described in ways that are natural extensions from truth conditions, insofar as they have them, getting the core truth conditions right is like a minimal condition of adequacy. And that's something linguists did not have before. In the earlier work, in the arguments with generative and interpretive semanticists, it's like, my semantic representation is better than your semantic representation. And how do you decide? You know, it was very, I mean, I was interested in semantic questions, but I didn't ever think I'd become a semanticist because it seemed like a swamp. There was nothing, there was no hard data. And truth conditions, as inadequate as they might be in the long run, that's a little bit of hard data for the many simple sentences where they're clear. Cresswell, I didn't mention Cresswell's most certain principle that he uses to argue for this point, is that we may not know what meanings are. One thing is certain, if we've got sentences, and I can imagine a situation in which one of them is true and the other one is false, then we know that those two sentences do not have the same meaning. That's a very modest kind of claim, and very, you know, it's unobjectionable. But as Cresswell goes on to show, you can get a lot of work out of just that much. You know, it's so truth conditions as a basic part to get a handle on, to do some serious work, that's indisputable, I think.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I go down with the chat, and then there is a remark by Adam Kribus that probably you misspelled the name Lukasiewicz in one of your slides, the logician, the name of a Polish logician, Lukasiewicz.
Oh, of course, that's right. That's right. I that's a slide I made last night, and I did it fast, and I was going to go back and get. I was going to get my Polish L's in and all my spellings. I apologize.
Okay, good. Next question comes from Luke Burke, and please, could you ask your question about the method of fragments by Montague?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for the talk. It was wonderful. So my question is about the method of fragments. So Montague was very careful about defining, you know, giving well-defined fragments of language which his grammars were supposed to apply to. And but this method of cordoning off areas of language to study in a very precise way, has become less common in recent years, I would say. And do you think this is a negative thing? Do you think that, or do you think it actually is not necessarily a bad thing? And then why did this happen? Why was there this move away from this tendency to study well-defined fragments of language?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, in fact, the same thing happened in syntax. When you look at Chomsky, when you look at syntactic structures and Chomsky's early papers, you find syntactic fragments. You find complete syntactic descriptions for a fragment of natural language there too. And in syntax, the syntacticians stopped doing that. In syntax, I think I know what happened is people began thinking that they understood a lot of parts of the grammar, and so they could focus on some particular area to work on. Say, I'm just going to work on the syntax of of comparative adjective expressions or something, and just presuppose the rest of the grammar, is there. When I worked with two colleagues at UCLA on a big book putting together everything that had been done in transformational grammar up till then, we certainly found, and doing it explicitly, we certainly found that presupposing that the rest of the grammar and what you do is going to fit in it is not an innocent assumption. So I worry about that in syntax a certain amount as well. Syntacticians, I think, don't even try anymore because they don't like writing explicit rules that seem too stipulative. They want principles from which all kinds of things will follow, and that would take a lot of work to cash it out really explicitly to make it falsifiable. So I think kind of similarly in semantics, the farther the field progresses, the more things you would be ready to put into your fragment if you were to make one, but then it's a lot of work. Sometimes I think of it as it's a little bit like designing an airplane. You have some people working on the engineering of the structure of the body. You have other people working on the electronic components in the cockpit. And to try to draw one big picture of the whole thing seems beyond everybody's limit. But somebody somewhere has to make sure everything fits together. So I think it's not unreasonable practice, but there is a danger, and there should always be some people trying to check the consistency and whether parts really can all fit together.
Thanks. But I've also noticed that maybe in areas like categorical grammar and Lambek grammars, there's more attention to this method of fragments. And
that's true. That's true. And certainly everybody who works on computational linguistics in symbolic forms, not the statistical versions, when you do anything computational, you're forced to be explicit about everything. So having friends who are computational linguists who hang on to this idea of explicitness, that I find also very healthy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there is the question and remark by Rohit Parikh, which sort of started a little discussion in the chat. I will not read it all, but it starts with the remark that I find Barbara's lecture simply fantastic. But the essence of the matter is that one should pay more attention to game theory and game semantics. So maybe you can comment what you think about game semantics in relation to language. Mm-hmm.
The history of formal pragmatics. I talked only about semantics. Is my connection still okay?
Connection is a little bit.
Can you hear me okay?
A little bit bad,
but
I think it will be better in a second or two. So you continue speaking. Mm-hmm.
I hope. So there are people working in formal pragmatics that make very strong use of game theory. Of part of how we interpret what a speaker meant when they said a sentence that they did is comparing it with other things they might have said and didn't say. And the speaker is thinking about how the hearer will interpret what he says, and that will influence what he says. I'm not saying that very clearly, but game theory and bidirectional game theory is indeed playing a big role in formal pragmatics. And formal pragmatics and formal semantics are becoming more and more seamless wholes. So yes, it's there.
Rohit, if you are here, maybe you would like to add something or ask a bit more. If not, then let's go on. Oops. Okay. Okay. The next question comes from, I think Yuri Gorevich wanted to ask a question. So please, Yuri. Mm-hmm.
First, thank you very much. Much enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you. I enjoyed yours.
There seems to be an obvious limitation on how much formal methods can reach, because language is always in flux, always changing. It's not only vocabulary changing, the grammar is changing. We say, if you look at English, certain sounds have been lost, new sounds were acquired, some sounds became very strange, especially in, say, in French. Some people find it comical, French sounds. So also, nobody really has an understanding of the whole English or Russian. All of us have very approximate and probabilistic understanding of various terms. We can disagree on the meanings of various things. And I think it's a good thing. There would be no humor if it always was very, very precise. People often, my former Russian colleagues often ask me why America sticks to this strange system, feet and miles. And I'll tell them, do you realize that a kilometer is much longer than a mile? How come? I just think, kilometer. It's much longer. So now, how can you do it in formal language? So it, just sorry for such a long question. I'm about to converge. Many years ago, I had a talk at Michigan, and the visitor was the chief linguist of Boeing. It was strange that Boeing has a chief linguist. And he told about very practical and interesting problem. So Boeing has those manuals, and they're translated to 150 languages or so. And it's very important, the translation is very precise because it's aviation. So what they did, they created a kind of mini English, very restricted vocabulary, very restricted grammar, and every manual has to be written in this restricted language. And then they had formal translators from that restricted language to restricted languages in Russian and Hungarian or whatever. And it struck me as a very pragmatic approach and sort of gives an interesting idea of an extent you can actually formalize the language. Okay, the end of question.
Great, that's great. No, I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I wrote a paper, I think it was in the 80s, called something like Belief Sentences and the Limits of Semantics, arguing that no one person ever knows their language, that there are parts of the language that are indeterminate at any moment. I had an example sentence that was something like, so-and-so believes that semantics is a branch of psychology, but so-and-so other person believes that it is a branch of mathematics. And the it refers back to the word semantics, so it should have the same reference. But what is its reference, such that it can be, on the one hand, possibly a branch of mathematics, and on the other hand, possibly a branch of psychology? And it's, a term like semantics, it's kind of up for grabs. I mean, all the competing theories are partly different theories of what semantics even is, right? So to try to say there is a fixed meaning for the term semantics is problematic. And you, I believe it's a good thing that this openness in terms is what lets us understand each other across a lot of differences of opinion. And that's what lets the language change, because these partly indeterminate things can go in one direction or another. So one hand, yes, the language is always changing. There's limits to being able to pin it down at any moment. But I don't think any of those things are obstacles to the methods of formalization that we're talking about. Certainly in phonology, the theory of the phonological change in languages over time, the 19th century theories of how language change worked and how language change was very regular and could be described beautifully. So I think, yeah, I think these are real problems that when I've also given talks sometimes about creativity in language. That Chomsky, when he talks about linguistic creativity, it's a kind of a building block creativity. I call it maybe a Lego creativity. You know, you have these parts and you can make infinitely many sentences from them following these rules. But when you get down to the kind of lexical level that you were talking about, creativity can be much larger. We invent new terms for realia that didn't exist a decade ago, and we endow terms with new meanings when we want to express some new idea. So there can, I think of language in a way like jazz. You know, we're given some basic structure on which we can then improvise a certain amount. And all those things make language, natural language, much richer than any formal language we could write down in usual ways of writing down a formal language. But the tools of studying it and how these things work, I think that's still possible, as long as we don't try to pin down more than can be pinned down. I mean, even a simple example, possessive phrases like John's book, that relation, that possessive relation, that's not just ownership. That can be all sorts of relationship. John's team can be the team he plays for, the team he owns, the team he writes newspaper articles about. So that's a place where we better put in a variable in the interpretation. And it's a context dependent variable. And the context can be partly of our own creation. So if we know what things to pin down and what things to leave open and how to leave these open places for them, then I think all these wonderful properties that make language so rich and changeable are still describable.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, now comes the very short and concrete question from Sasha Shane. Could you ask it yourself, Alexander? Mm-hmm. Your voice is not heard, unfortunately. Mm-hmm.
Unmute yourself, Sasha.
Uh-huh. Yes.
I see Alice.
Probably comes from a different. He unmuted, but the microphone is probably
not connected.
Yes. Let me read it instead. So Sasha writes, maybe one could read the semantics of English and the, and finally learn how to use that correctly. Seriously, is there some popular, understandable exposition of these semantics?
Well, good luck. I have read a lot of works on the semantics of the Russian imperfective and perfective, and I still don't use them correctly. In fact, my Volodya and I have written papers about Russian genitive of negation, and I still don't use that correctly all the time. Yeah, no.
Is there some more or less known set of rules that would, if one follows them, the use will be correct? Or is it totally on some level indeterminate?
No, it's somewhere in between those two. I mean, there's I don't know the answer to that question. I think it was my first year at MIT. Someone sent a Russian physics student to me to help him with his English so he could pass his language exam. And one of his first questions to me was about and the. And I started trying to explain it to him, and I very quickly realized what a difficult question that is. But it's nice to know it's often predictable from context. Just get a few little actions from. You can take Russian sentences that have no articles in them, and we generally know must be not totally, but partly.
Okay, it seems that your sound also has some disturbance right now.
Oh,
but
sorry.
you basically heard the answer, so I think we go to the next questions. There are many, and we should speed up a little bit.
Are the questions going to be saved somewhere where I can see them later?
Yes, they're saved in
I certainly
chat.
can't.
This chat is visible. You can read it, but let me go at a somewhat faster pace.
Will it be visible afterwards?
Yes, yes. In the recording of your lecture, we do save the chat, so it's probably
good.
Will be
Thank
there.
you.
Yeah, but maybe we should publish it separately as a file on mat-net, because it's in the cloud. It's going to be a separate text file, actually. So usually
we will find the right way to preserve this for the future. There is a remark on the wrong translation of the word elm in Russian, so that's not yasin, this is vyaz. I checked that this is correct. That was a difficult one.
Thank you.
Okay. Then there is a remark by Alistair Merlin. Maybe you would like to.
Oh, good.
To make your remark.
Friend and co-author. Happy to see Alice.
So Alice, please turn on your sound. We don't hear you, Alice.
Excuse me.
Oh, yes.
I just.
Hi, Alice. Hi,
sorry.
Alice.
Sorry. It's wonderful to be able to participate in this incredibly interesting discussion and to see all your Russian colleagues. Really, really interesting. So I'm not sure which remark of mine you're referring to, Mr. Chair.
The one in the chat.
But there's so many by now.
But you can select any remark you want and make it.
Oh, well, I was very much taken by an issue that was just now addressed, namely the difference between a and the. And I was hoping Barbara would sort of grab that occasion to illustrate that, in fact, these two determiners have driven much of the discussion in the development of dynamic semantics, where context and context updating plays such an important role. And the distinction between a and the was suddenly, to many of our sort of more classically trained logicians, clarified as the follows. Namely, a is typically used when you introduce somebody that is new to the conversation or new to the context, if you want. Whereas you use the when you assume that your participants in the conversation already know who you're talking about or what you're talking about, right? So there is what we call now a familiarity assumption, an assumption that you already are familiar with that topic or the entity that you want to talk about. And that issue has been an incredible eye-opener for people like me, who were basically educated on a Russellian distinction between an existential quantifier and an existential quantifier with a uniqueness clause, where I remember even in my baby logic class, I said, what uniqueness calls? It's no uniqueness in some sort of total world sense, but there is some sort of restricted notion of uniqueness associated with the definite determiner. And then a lot of work that has gone into the formalization of the semantics of presuppositions exploited that. And the whole, distinction between presuppositions and propositions goes back very directly to the classical debate between Strawson and Russell, right? Where Strawson, in my own understanding, had a much more natural language sympathy, if you want, than Russell, who was very obviously anti-natural anything, let alone language, right? So, I mean, the developments have really, with the hindsight that we have, which is more than 50 years by now, fitted into that debate, I think. Not so much a question, Barbara, but more of a comment.
Good,
yeah.
Good, thank you. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Though it still doesn't, I mean, it doesn't answer all the questions of use, but yeah.
No.
True, but that you're right that those two little words have been really crucial in a lot of the developments in dynamic semantics. Great.
Yeah. I learned to explain it this way when I had quite a few Korean students who also baffled by the use of A and B, and the familiarity issue was something that they could understand.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. There was some discussion in the chat, apparently urgent questions, how to save the questions in the chat for this lecture for the future that we have already promised to take care of. Also, the recordings of all the videos of all the lectures will be put on internet or on this portal, which is called mat-net.ru, where our mathematical conferences are and seminars are saved. So you will be able to get to these recordings through the page of this meeting. So this will be easy. So I would like now to ask simply those who didn't write in chat anything, but if there are some questions, further questions, maybe if someone wants to ask, then it's a good time to do it. Okay, let me then finish. If there are no, let me ask the final question in this session, and this is how do you see the perspectives of formal semantics on the whole, so to say? Is this approach competitive? Will it be competitive in the future compared to other, or so? What do you see will happen in the next, 20 years with formal semantics?
What do you think was subsumed by big data and statistics?
Yes, but I mean, of course.
Well, I think it will be alive and well, and a complement to big data and statistics. I remember when there was a roundtable session at MIT when they were celebrating their 150th birthday, and a lot of different panels on the general issue of language, mind, and computation. And when I was giving my little 10-minute stuff on formal semantics, I at the end I said, I think we have made and will continue to make great progress in formal semantics, but I don't expect us to be useful for anything like Google Translate anytime soon. And it turned out that Peter Norvig was there in the audience, and afterwards he came and he said, well, we're starting to hire linguists now because you do better at negation than we do. So I think it's compatible. No, I think it's a great field, and well, there's so many things I didn't talk about. I mean, like formal semantics, since it's younger field than syntax and morphology. Some of the directions are also younger, but working on language acquisition and on language processing, trying to get a handle on what kind of model theoretic reasoning goes on when we understand sentences. I mean, the model theoretic perspective is not easy to translate into psycholinguistic thinking, but there's progress on that. There's lots of progress on language typology. I think one of the first big projects was already 30 years ago or so. Emin Bach and Angelika Kratzer and I headed a project on cross-linguistic quantification, asking, do all languages have noun phrases that are interpreted as generalized quantifiers? And it seems that the answer is no. And some languages rather use something more like adverbial quantification, which David Lewis studied. Things like a quadratic equation always has two roots, rather than saying every quadratic equation has two roots. So it's a rich field, and I think it's a constantly changing and adapting field. So it's in the hands of the younger people now. I'm writing the history. I'm better on the first 30 years than I am on trying to imagine the next 30.
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. It was a pleasure to have you here. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to do it.
Big success.
Yeah.
Very much. Thanks for participating. Okay, then I officially close this our logical perspectives open lectures. So if you have, but this Zoom meeting is not yet closed. So if you can continue writing in chat and asking questions or just communicating with each other if you see.
I'll stay here as long as anyone wants.
Yeah. Okay.
Many thanks to organizers. It was really, really great 2 days. Fantastic.
Yes. My thanks too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I stop recording. That's from now on, the recording is stopped.
Thank you very much.